Good afternoon to our CLA family, friends, colleagues, and community partners. Welcome back to our live stream. We have a jam-packed show today, so let's quickly get the housekeeping out of the way first. Please continue to send us your questions through our inbox at livestream@claconnect.com, and we'll answer what we can during the session and follow up as we are able. You may also reach out to us directly after the session for specific consultation at claconnect.com on the COVID resource page using the Contact Us button. We wanted to start with a quick technical update. The IRS recently released the updated version of Form 941X. The newest version incorporates changes from the Families First and CARES Act. You may have been awaiting release of this in order to amend second quarter returns to claim either Families First paid leave or CARES Act employee retention credits that were missed on the original return. So it's now available. Now, I want to call your attention to the IRS instructions. The July 2020 revision of Form 941X is used to correct the second quarter 2020 Forms 941 and 941SS, as well as those filed earlier quarters. Now, the IRS will revise the forms for the third quarter of 2020, so therefore, look for an October 2020 revision of Form 941X that you'll use to make corrections to third quarter forms. So please stay tuned for more on this. We've got articles and updates on our CLA Connect COVID resource page to help you through that, and also contact us through our BizOps team for that. Speaking of BizOps, in our session today, we are talking about business forecasting and modeling in COVID and the unique considerations related to these challenges that we face during these times. We're also going to answer some more of your questions about PPP forgiveness as they come available. And I'm incredibly excited to have our guests with us today. So starting first, we have Jennifer Witz, who is a Chief Financial Officer in our BizOps practice. Kelsey Voxis is the principal who leads our nonprofit outsourced accounting practice. And you all remember Rick Kruger, who's a principal in our National Assurance Group. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks.
Thanks so much for being here. I'd like to open our dialogue today with Jennifer and the discussion of the 2021 financial planning process. 2020, Jennifer, has been so turbulent that I know a lot of our clients are saying to us, is it even worth spending the time to put together a 2021 plan, having faced so much uncertainty this year?
Yeah, I could see why that question's valid, but I think it's absolutely worth the time. Although there is so much uncertainty right now, your plan will probably be wrong, but there's still so much value that you can get out of the process itself. Accuracy of the financial plan isn't the main objective. So the real value in budgeting and forecasting is found in the thought process and the conversations that you're going to have with your leadership team. So I would use this next planning cycle to really try to get creative with that leadership team. Talk about the different strategies that you could employ, get creative with different alternatives, develop different scenarios, so best, worst, and most likely cases, and just really collaborate with your team. So if you're able to do those things effectively and generate new ideas, you'll get some real value out of this budgeting cycle, regardless of the accuracy of your output.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering if you could give me some examples of what you're seeing related to this in the marketplace.
Over the past few months, businesses have found innovative ways to adapt and reinvent, and I'm sure everyone's seen stories of these in the news. But we, here at CLA, we've seen clients transform their sewing line that was used for manufacturing decorative pillows to manufacturing face masks. We've worked with an employee rewards business that was focused on incenting sales that then shifted their business to an employee wellness business, so focused more on connecting their teams rather than incentivizing their teams. And even here at CLA, we've reimagined how we could support our clients. Back in March, when COVID hit, within a matter of days, we put together a COVID task force team, which Jen and Rick and Kelsey are all aware of, but it really was to figure out new ways that we could help our clients. So planning around all the tax credits, as well as developing tools to help size the PPP loan and track forgiveness. So these were things that we've never done before, and we really needed to pivot in order to provide a service for what our clients needed today. So, view this planning cycle as an opportunity to find creative ways to transform your business. And I would start with asking questions like, what do my customers need now, and how can we shift our business so that we remain relevant? How can I connect with my customers in this virtual world? Rethink your marketing strategies. So if you need to have more digital content, that might be a great way to still reach out to your prospects. And think through your delivery model. Can you implement more contactless delivery methods? So these are all questions that may lead you to reinventing your business to better serve your clients in terms of their needs in this environment today.
I think that's such a helpful guide to the process. And I know we start having some unique considerations when it comes to the nonprofit space. So, Kelsey, I'd like to pivot the discussion to you and just ask, is there anything unique to nonprofits that they need to know about budgeting and forecasting?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. And, I think nonprofits, while a lot of their budgeting approach and processes are typically similar to what any business should do, in some ways, nonprofits are more well equipped for planning in this uncertainty, because every year we go into saying, okay, we might know that we have these few government grants, for example, but we really don't know what our donors are going to do this year. We really don't have a lot to rely on. And so in some ways, our nonprofits are more used to budgeting like this, but I think are having to look at this more from a scenario planning sort of perspective to say, how long is COVID going to last? How long is that going to impact our ability to serve our clients or the way we have to serve them? And maybe we come up with 3 or 4 or even 5 scenarios that if COVID lasts through this date and our clients need this sort of help, and these government grants are available, here's what we look like. If it's something different, here's what we look like. And so you kind of got to throw your old planning process out the window. A lot of our clients were saying, let's zoom out a little. Let's roll up our budget lines and let's actually look at a higher level, because we're going to have to come up with so many scenarios that budgeting our supplies line item doesn't really matter as much this year as it has in the past.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love when you say zoom out, and you and I've been talking a lot about perspective lately. So, as we do that, and as we gather some of our perspective, can you talk about what are some of the big pain points and unknowns for organizations right now?
Sure. So, in particular in the nonprofit space, a few things. One is individual donors. So, historically, organizations could look at their trends and say, okay, we've added this many donors. We can typically expect an increase of X from this donor base, and we'll be good to go. I think a big question a lot of our clients are dealing with right now is, did our individual donors actually push up their donations and just donate earlier this year? When COVID hit, we actually saw an increase in philanthropy. That's fantastic. But the question is, was that people just paying early? Are they going to pay again in December come year end? Now, there are some nice tax incentives for people to do that and businesses to be more generous. And so we're hoping that comes through. But that's a big piece of a big consideration. Another thing is just around government grants. There's frankly been a lot of additional funding coming to nonprofits who can provide services. I had a call yesterday with a community action organization who's doubled in size in the last 6 months because there's been a need for food shelf. There's been a need for temporary housing that's greater than it's ever been, and they've been able to get government funding to support that. The question is, those are short-term grants. Those run out the end of this year. What's going to be available next year? Can they operate at that scale, and can they count on those revenues? So again, they're having to kind of look at a couple of different options. And then the last thing I'd say around government revenues, and this is true for any contractors, for-profits as well, who have government contracts, is state and local governments' tax bases are getting depleted greatly by what's happening. And so are they going to have the ability to have the level of contracts or grants in future years just because their tax base has gone down and they don't have as much coming in to push back out? So those are the big things that a lot of our nonprofits and some businesses are having to consider as well.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So, really what I hear you saying is that we're talking about less traditional financial planning. So, one of the questions that we wanted to address today is to have you talk about when we talk about traditional financial planning, we also need to talk now about dynamic modeling. And so, could you tell me what is this dynamic modeling, Jennifer, probably you, and how it's different from our traditional financial planning process?
Well, what we really mean by dynamic modeling is just thinking through what are your major inputs and assumptions that drive your business and building out your financial model in a way that allows you to quickly adjust those inputs and assumptions so that changes will automatically flow through your entire plan. So it's really giving you the flexibility to say, if certain things happen, this is how it'll impact my financial results. If they don't, then I can quickly model that out as well. So in a technical context, this just means really drawing on your Excel skills. And ensuring that none of your formulas include hard-coded assumptions, but rather they reference those assumptions in isolated input cells so that you can quickly make changes. And so I've done this for myself and a number of clients, and some of the levers that I like to be able to move around quickly. Payroll, for example, make sure that you have a separate payroll tab and you're able to change the dates of new hires so you can push them out if you need to or bring them forward, as well as, unfortunately, if you have to factor in some terminations, just make sure that that's dynamic so you can see what those different scenarios look like. Other assumptions and inputs that you want to make sure are dynamic are your sales quantities. So as you phase that out by month and hopefully you start to see increases over time, so you can quickly make those changes and see how that impacts pricing. So if you feel that there is some compression on your pricing, that you're able to model that out. Any costs associated with your major materials that need to go into inventory or your production. Other things to think about is how long does it take to collect cash or to pay your bills? So trying to keep your DSO and your DPO dynamic as well is going to help you with the cash flow modeling. So if you plan your budget using a dynamic model, you're just going to have a lot more flexibility to understand what the financial impacts are as things change so rapidly. And you'll be able to adjust accordingly and create some different versions for scenario planning.
Yeah, Jennifer, that really helps people understand, I think, the certain key elements that need to be able, I like that you called it different levers to push that are really going to impact the plan. When we talk about the different levers, can you talk to me a little bit about how the various stimulus packages and tax credits, that we've been addressing on the live streams and just everybody's been facing in the payroll, how does that affect planning for 2021?
Well, while the planning cycle, we're stepping into this uncertain time, or we've been living in this uncertain time, there are some things that are pretty highly predictable that you can incorporate into your plan, but they're new. So my concern is that people will forget to incorporate these things into their plan. So if you think about the cash impacts of all these different stimulus packages and tax credits, we need to think through the timing of those, of when those are going to hit your cash flow forecast. So just some big ones to keep in mind: if you have a PPP loan, when are you going to apply for forgiveness? And if there's a portion that won't be forgiven, then you need to start scheduling out those payments and calculating the interest that goes along with that as well. If you have an idle loan, you need to factor those payments into your cash flow forecast. Another big one, if you're an employer who's taken advantage of the payroll tax deferral, those will be due at the end of 2021 and 2022. So you'll need to factor in those lump sums, and those could be quite sizable. So just making sure that you've factored in all of those different stimulus packages that have come through, and you really nail down the timing of those cash impacts, that's going to help make your financial model a little bit more accurate.
Excellent. And that's really helpful. One question that I've been wondering is, should organizations be aiming for a balanced budget in 2021?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I'll jump in on this one and would love to hear from Jennifer as well. But from a nonprofit perspective, we hear the term balanced budget, and to me, it just sends up all sorts of red flags. Because if you have a balanced budget that balances to zero, that tells me there's some baloney in there, and you can sub in a different word if you want. That something in there isn't what you actually thought it was going to be. It's what you need it to be to hit zero. And usually that's in your individual fundraising line. And those poor fundraising and development professionals, I know how many of you get that loaded on you to say, well, for us to make our budget, you need to raise 35% more this year, which just isn't fair. So, my perspective is typically, I don't want to see a balanced budget where the balance is exactly to zero unless you have a plug number in there for expenses that's called contribution to reserves, because that really means that's your profit that you are tucking away for a rainy day or saving for a strategic reason. So, that's my kind of run-of-the-mill answer to that question any day of the week. I think in COVID times in particular, maybe you have a goal of trying to get closer to balanced. I think a lot of organizations need to be realistic that next year might be a year that you're going to balance a deficit budget. And hopefully you've built up your reserves in the good times, and that you're able to fund a deficit this next year. The other thing, and this ties into what Jennifer mentioned, is about your PPP loan. I had a conversation with a nonprofit I'm on the board of yesterday, and we were saying, well, strategically, should we actually wait until 2021 to apply for forgiveness so that we're recognizing the revenue next year, knowing that this year we had other funding sources and there's other things that kind of worked out. Next year we know is going to be a rough year. And again, does that look better, quote unquote, than having a large deficit, even though we have the reserves to fund it? So I think some of it is strategically, what is the story you're trying to tell? Because you do have some ability to kind of shift the timing of those things based on what makes the most sense for your organization and what supports the direction that you're going in.
I think that's really helpful, and it leads us right to a question I think that we hear all the time with PPP, which is, let's talk cash and accrual. So, can you talk to me about the differences between cash basis and accrual basis budgeting and what organizations need to know when it comes to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say in the nonprofit world, anyone who has restricted funds, I think lives in a world where you have to look at cash and accrual ongoing, but a lot of other organizations and businesses don't. So I think it's important, particularly right now, to start with the cash basis and to look at that first and try and figure out, make sure you can actually cover your costs, make sure that you have the money to make payroll from a week to week or month to month basis. But then I do think it's also important to look at accrual, because for those of you who are audited or who have, public financial statements, that's what's going to be shown to the world. And so you want to make sure you understand what that's going to look like as well. But I think today, a lot of times, what we're seeing and what we're doing with our clients is budgeting cash first, and then kind of backing into what that accrual budget looks like. Jennifer, would you differ on the for-profit side?
No, I would not. I would start with cash. I think that's the most important aspect right now. Things have changed significantly, and especially as PPP funds run out, we need to make sure that you're covering those expenses and thinking through all those cash impacts that I previously mentioned and that you mentioned as well. But accrual is still very important, especially on the for-profit side. Is if we, have a business where we had to focus in on margins, oftentimes cash can't get you there. You need to think through matching your revenue and expenses, and we do that through accrual. So having both and planning to actually model out both scenarios, I think is a great idea.
Yeah, I think that's really good to understand. And, one of the questions that keeps coming up in my mind is, with all of this uncertainty, how can we possibly do a 12-month budget? Are there other ways that we can look at this?
Yeah, there's a couple that I think of. So one is just remembering that 12 months is really an arbitrary timeline, right? Someone at some point came up with the fact that that's a year, but we don't all just start and stop our operations at that time. So right now we're actually working with a lot of clients to say, let's take the last quarter or two of this year and let's project in the first 2 quarters of next year, and let's look at that as a 12-month cycle and kind of see where you land. And then we also have some clients who are saying, let's build out a budget for a year, but let's only take Q1 and Q2 to the board for approval at this point, and let them know that maybe Q3 and Q4, once we get through the first quarter, then we'll take the rest of the year. Then we'll know enough more to bring the rest of the year budget for approval. So we're seeing quite a bit of that, as well as I've got some clients where one of them, their calendar year end, we ended up with 4 different scenarios. We're bringing 4 scenarios to the board next week. And then the board's going to say, we really think we should narrow in on these 2. And so then we're going to dig in a little deeper on those 2 over the next few months. And then hopefully by December, we can figure out which one is the right one. And then they'll ultimately approve. So we're kind of pushing our timeline from what we normally would do so that we can keep getting closer and closer to which scenario we think is going to be most likely. So a couple different options there on how you can think about timing.
Well, I think that's really helpful. And really, all of this data is so key to any organization, adds a lot of value, I guess, to the discussions that our clients and community partners are having in this week and next as they're working through year-end planning and review. I know we have some questions coming in for you guys that we'll take at the end. So thank you so much for this to this point. Right now, I'd like to pivot to some of the other questions coming in for Rick and talk about PPP forgiveness. So welcome back, Rick. The first question I have for you, and I'm just going to read it, comes from Bob related to the review process and when we'll see some formal guidance. He says, I understand that as part of their review of the loan forgiveness application, the SBA is going to look to see if the applicant was eligible for a loan in the first place. He wants to know if his understanding is correct. And if so, what are the criteria that the SBA is going to use as part of this review process? And if they conclude that the borrower was ineligible, will that result in denial of forgiveness for the entire loan? And then he goes on to ask, like, hey, is the SBA going to formalize and detail the review process in an IFR maybe? So I know there's a lot packed into that, but it all sort of relates to review. So Rick, I was wondering if you could just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, happy to. There's definitely some great questions there. And I think most of us still have lots of anxiety when it comes to the SBA review process. And as quick background for everybody here, borrowers turn in their forgiveness applications to their lender, who does a high-level review within 60 days. Many, but not all lenders have started accepting those applications, and we haven't seen a ton of volume so far across our clients. We're hearing maybe 10% or so have turned in an application at this point. After the lenders complete with their review, then they submit it to the SBA, who's also going to do a review, and they have 90 days to do that before a conclusion is made as to forgiveness. There's a little bit of information out there in an IFR on what the SBA is looking for. I think we're all looking for some practical examples, though. We've seen a lot go to SBA. We haven't heard of anything coming back to banks or borrowers to say yay or nay. So a lot of uncertainty, and that's where some of the anxiety is coming from. As far as eligibility specifically, for many borrowers, this will really be the first time anyone reviews eligibility. So it really is an important topic. If we think about how fast PPP was set up and implemented in the first place, it was a scramble, and the priority was getting money out the door to borrowers who needed it. It wasn't on reviewing that. So there was a lot of reliance on borrower certifications that they were eligible, not a lot of vetting of that. Hopefully, though, eligibility won't be that large of a hurdle for borrowers as they're turning these things in. I'll point out a few things, though, that might help. Some of the questions around eligibility are going to be pretty straightforward. Hopefully that helps borrowers get a pretty good feel at this point. For example, eligible entity types is generally pretty clear. The economic needs certification, if you're below 2 million, SBA gave you a safe harbor. So that's really helpful. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we are seeing a fair amount of enforcement action for fraud cases. So we've been hearing more and more stories of people that took multiple loans, say bought a yacht then with the proceeds. Clearly, that's a violation. You should probably get on the phone with a defense attorney at this point. But hopefully that's not the majority that we're talking about. There's still a lot of questions in the gray. And that really is troublesome, where there's a lot of PPP that's subjective. So really the theme that I would say, if I were in Bob's shoes, is, really make sure that you've got a pretty thick file documenting why you needed the loan, how you met the requirements of it, and how you used the proceeds to retain employees. If you do have concerns about eligibility, an attorney really would be the best person to turn to for that. A lot of our clients are already working with attorneys to proactively document this type of stuff in case the SBA does poke around at it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think that's really helpful. You mentioned the best practices of having an attorney. Another person wrote in, Darwin, and he asked a question related to best practices and what might trigger some red flags. He says, we utilized a separate account to determine the actual qualified PPP expenditures, the payroll, rent, utilities, and spent as much of the money as they could, for payroll, rent, and everything else, which was defined as a best practice by many professionals in the industry talking about how to do this. Then he said, look, we were unable to spend all of the loan amount covered for covered expenses during the original 8 weeks. Then the day after his covered period ended, they amended the PPP to extend the covered period to 24 weeks. Now he's wondering, is it a red flag not to submit rent as documented in the original 8-week period out of that segregated account and just go to the payroll cost for the 24 weeks to substantiate or spend the entire loan amount? So I think it would be helpful if you could just kind of talk about some best practices and what are these red flags.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that that shouldn't be an issue, as I understand the question. Well, a separate bank account can help keep track of things. Really, the important part when it comes to PPP is having thorough documentation that's clearly organized. So I wouldn't get too hung up about the account specifically, but I would spend a lot of time as a borrower with the application instructions, making sure I understand line by line what I'm filling in there. To the extent any of us can understand what the SBA puts out, and that documentation that I have lines up with what I'm filling out in the application, and also meets the requirements. The application instructions do lay out slightly over a page of all the documentation requirements. So that's really where I think some extra effort now is going to pay off later, is making sure you understand the instructions and have a very clearly organized, thorough packet of documentation that you can turn in and support what you're doing.
Excellent. Now, Dennis is asking if any information has been presented as to how to use the FTE safe harbor. He's saying his FTEs have decreased and he wants to calculate how best to manage that.
There is a little bit of information out there, but for better or worse, SBA has kept that certification for that safe harbor pretty open to interpretation. So we don't know exactly how SBA intends to apply that. SBA did give a little guidance in late June along with an example in an interim final rule. And in that guidance, what they stated was if your business activity, if you had a reduction in business activity during the covered period, and that stemmed directly or indirectly from compliance with COVID requirements or guidance, you're exempt from the FTE test. What exactly that means, though, is a little bit hard to understand. SBA did say that state and local requirements are included. It's not just federal level requirements, but if the state issued a shutdown order, if a local municipality had a shutdown order, that would all count. They did give an example of this applying to a business with a shutdown order. So I think there are some clear-cut situations where it does apply. But I've certainly heard lots of questions that I would say fall in the gray. And so that's where, with a lot of PPP, I think maybe a belt and suspenders approach helps. That maybe that's the direction you go, but be ready in case they rule that out, that you could still get to full forgiveness another way too.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I agree with you that caution is king at this point in the game. I think a lot of people are also wondering about interest. A good question just popped in that starts with an example of, say the loan is $100,000 received on May 1st of 2020, and the forgiveness is allowed starting February 1st of 21. The questions are, does interest accrue between May and February? And then especially if the loan repayment is supposed to start on December 1st, would the interest paid be part of the forgiveness process?
Yeah, good question. So the two pieces, as far as interest accrual, interest does accrue from the start of the loan, but you're only responsible to pay interest on the portion of the loan that's not forgiven. So to the extent that you have full forgiveness or any portion of it, interest on that part that's forgiven, you do not need to pay that. The SBA covers that. As far as when payments would start, I think some of this might be a little outdated, and the bank loan agreements don't help the confusion with this, that loan payments shouldn't really need to start on December 1st for that loan. That was the original term of the loan. That was extended with the PPP Flexibility Act. So we do get a little bit of additional time. So hopefully that shouldn't be an issue, because you get 10 months from the end of your covered period to apply and get that determined.
Excellent. I think that's really helpful. We have a ton of questions popping into the inbox, but one of them is coming back for Kelsey, if I can bring you back in, about the budgeting process, which is, when is the right time to start this budgeting process, and how many different scenarios should we be building out?
Yeah, great question. So let's just assume we're talking calendar year here. I know for a lot of nonprofits, you're actually a 6/30, and so you're already into your year. You got to budget in March and April, which I'm sure was super fun. But assuming that you're a calendar year, I would say if you haven't started already, I'd start tomorrow. And mostly that is that I'm a big fan of a collaborative budgeting process. And what that means is that you've got more people involved, which means it takes more time. So I half jokingly, but really I would start tomorrow. I would start by saying, what are the most likely scenarios we want to model out? So for example, I've got an association where we said, okay, scenario one is all year long, we're going to be able to have live events. Scenario 2 is the first 6 months of the year, they're going to be virtual. The second half, they're going to be live. And scenario 3 is we're going to be virtual all year long. And so come up with what your scenarios are, come up with your template, and then have your team start populating a budget for each one of those scenarios. Then make sure that you have enough time to roll those up, compare, make the edits like you normally would, but you're doing it times 3 this time, right? Because you've got 3 scenarios. And then again, this gives you the flexibility. If you start now and let's say by October 15th, you have kind of a firm set of 3 scenarios, now you can be starting to measure, okay, what's going on in the environment? What's going on in the economy? Which one of these is most likely? Because from October through the end of December, you're going to be basically evaluating to say, which of these scenarios am I going to go forward with, even if I'm just going forward with it for the first quarter.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And we learned a lot, right, in 2020. So when everybody says, well, we don't know anything, if 2020 taught us anything in 2021, it's that we did learn. And as you said, we can start planning for different contingencies. So I think that's really helpful. Jennifer, what I'm wondering is if as we do this planning and our budget shows a decline in business, one of the questions that came in was how do we manage that communication with the board of directors and other stakeholders in the business?
Yeah, that can be tricky. But my recommendation is just to make sure that you emphasize that we want the budget to be realistic. Presenting an unrealistic budget to make the conversation easier right now is not going to add value to this process at all. But just tying back into what Kelsey said, if you come to the board and say, well, here are our different scenarios. Here's our worst case, our best case, and our most likely. That allows you to kind of walk each of those scenarios back and say, okay, for this best case, which everyone hopes for, what are all the things that have to go right to get there? Or what are all the things that have to go wrong to not get there? And then assess, whether those are realistic or not. So I think being flexible and presenting different scenarios and showing that you thought through all of those different scenarios and all the different assumptions that are associated with them, I think will make for a more constructive conversation. And then in addition to that, just making sure that if you're flexible, that the board remains flexible and you can always revisit it. So again, Kelsey mentioned some of this incremental budgeting. Hey, this is the plan we're going to go forward. Let's draw a line in the sand and let's have a handshake and say, in 3 months or whatever the time frame, we're going to revisit this and we will adapt from there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. One last question that I'll throw out there is, when do we recognize the PPP loan forgiveness as income if you are on the accrual basis? Do you estimate the forgiveness portion in 2020 return, even if it's forgiven in 2021? So could you guys speak to that before we wrap up? Because that seems to be a popular one coming through.
Yeah, happy to take that one, Jen.
Thanks.
I wish there were a quick answer I could give you in 30 seconds to make it nice and easy, but there are, from for-profit organizations, 4 different options to choose from, and nonprofits, 2 different options, which give a little bit of flexibility around this. I think the easiest way of doing it would be you reflect the forgiveness income when you actually get forgiven and you have legal release. But there definitely is flexibility and some things to consider. So a great topic to talk through. We do have an article in our COVID page on claconnect.com that addresses some of that, but definitely a good topic to work through a little bit more detail.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rick. And it's nice that you reference those articles. Definitely, for anybody watching, there is a lot more out there on that COVID resource page at claconnect.com. One of the things I'm watching our internal chat as well. We're even talking about hosting a roundtable maybe for some of the professional services organizations as they grapple with some of these questions and see if we can even dive a little deeper. So stay tuned for more to come on that as well. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much to our guests, our speakers, our moderators, excuse me, in the inbox, and to those of you who are watching for your engagement and your questions. Please continue to send your questions using the Contact Us button on our COVID resource page so that we can connect you with an advisor for some really specific consultation to meet your needs. We do have several articles on that website, and we'd like to be able to help support your conversations in the coming weeks as you budget for next year and do some of that dynamic financial modeling. We'd also like to ask that you register for our emails so that we can continue to invite you to our learning sessions and share some of these tools with you that might help you through the process. We're looking forward to seeing you next week when we continue to provide updates related to economic relief with some specific focus on professional services organizations for next week. week. Until then, please stay safe and healthy, and thank you for watching.